And I want to, first of all, this is a very large audience, right? Some of the benefits of Zoom is certainly our ability to conquer time and space and come together for these wonderful and intellectually stimulating events. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us. My name is Yoav. I direct the Center for the Study of the United States in partnership with Fulbright program at Tel Aviv University. And we are here first among many future collaborations between our center and the S. Daniel Abraham Center for International and Regional Studies, which we're co-hosting this event with us. And so I really want to thank everyone for joining us, certainly for our guest, Professor Michael Kazin at Georgetown, and Dr. Ronny Regev from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Just in terms of how this is going to work, right, where Professor Rein is going to give some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to invite Michael, and Michael's going to give about a half-hour talk, and then Dr. Regev is going to respond, and then if we have time, we'll try to get in a few questions from the audience, all right? So that's just in terms of how we're going to do this. Obviously, so much to say in terms of the election, and I don't think we could have a more knowledgeable and esteemed guest than Professor Kazin to talk to us, not just about the election, but about the influence of the American left and the future of the Democratic Party, American liberalism, things which Professor Kazin has obviously been writing about for decades, and we're very privileged and happy to be able to host him today. So having said that, I do want to invite Professor Rein. Professor Rein is the Elias Soroski Professor of Latin American and Spanish History. He recently finished his tenure, his very successful tenure as Vice President of Tel Aviv University, and I would like to invite him. He also, of course, heads the Daniel Abraham Center, and I want to invite him to give some introductory remarks. So Ronan, please.
Thank you so much, Yoav. Just a few words of greetings, no introductory remarks, nothing to worry about. So shalom and good evening to everyone. Here it's already 6 p.m. in Tel Aviv, and I take pleasure in welcoming you all to this new series of talks organized by the S. Daniel Abraham Center of Tel Aviv University. The title of this series is Challenging the Political Order, Social Movements and Mass Protests. And we start today with the widespread protests in the United States in the past year or so, and the effects on the Democratic Party and the election results, which Donald Trump still refuses to accept. And then next week, we move south to Chile, and we will have a talk on the recent referendum on the Constitution which was inspired by the former authoritarian leader, General Augusto Pinochet, and most Chileans voted to reform this constitution. Established in 2004, the S. Daniel Abraham Center for International and Regional Studies tries to promote discussion over issues of global importance and to assure a closer collaboration among the various institutes and centers at Tel Aviv University. And therefore, this series is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of the US, the Curiel Institute of European Studies, the Cummings Center for Russian and East European Studies, and the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies. We will have talks about Eastern Europe, Iran, etc. later on this year. Let me start the obvious. This is an academic event. And why do I bother you with this statement? Because to my great surprise, when we tried to promote this event through Google or through Facebook, we were blocked. It appears that a computer algorithm decided that this was a political event and therefore blocked us from promoting a specific, supposedly a specific political agenda. We certainly live in an interesting world. I would like to thank the staff of the Daniel Abraham Center, Ma'ayan Nahari, Omri Elmalech, and Chagai Rubinstein, for taking care of all the administrative and technical issues related with this series of lectures, as well as to Dr. Yoav Fumer, who also moderates this event, A special thanks, obviously, to Dr. Michael Kazin from Georgetown University, the first guest speaker in this series, and to all of you who have joined us from different countries and different institutions. Thank you so much. I'm sure we will have an interesting evening.
Right, thank you very much, Ronan. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kazin. And rarely, I think, when you introduce someone, do you not need any people, please just make sure your microphones are off. Okay, thank you. So, so I'm just privileged enough that Professor Kazin is kind of the standard bearer, I think, of historians of the left or of American liberalism. And I certainly, as someone who writes also history of 20th century liberalism, I look to him, and I've looked to him for many years, certainly admirably. And his books are a certain Rosetta Stone, I think, for understanding the history of the American left. And so in addition to being professor of history at Georgetown, and of course the co-editor of Dissent magazine, maybe one of the last bastions, I suppose, of the New York intellectual tradition, he also authored many very important historical works, among them The Populist Persuasion, which to this day, I think, it was written almost 25 years ago. It is still, I think, the best analysis of American populism. And even today, when I try to make sense of Trump, of Bernie Sanders, of American politics, I think that history is still so relevant. American Dreamers, a history of the American left, and my personal favorite is a Godly Hero, his wonderful biography of William Jennings Bryan. So having said that, I want to invite Professor Kazin to give his talk about the American left and the 2020 election. Michael, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to start off this series. I like to hear some of the other talks in it afterwards. It's a great treat to do this. I've only been to Israel once, unfortunately. Professor Perry was kind enough to show me around Tel Aviv at that time. So it's good to see him on the screen as well. I understand, of course, people have been following the election pretty closely over there. And so I hope some of what I tell you will be fresh and will provide some provocation, perhaps, for discussion and questions. First thing you do, though, is the typical academic move, which is to define my terms. What is the American left? I'd like to, sort of define it as left of liberalism, actually. I think Joe Biden is a liberal, but I'm not going to be talking about Joe Biden very much. I'm going to be talking about those to the left of Joe Biden who really populate, I think, a variety of social movements. For some reason, I'm trying to get my slide to go forward here. The pleasures of Zoom here. Let's see. Hold on a second. Okay. A variety of social movements. I'm not going to mention all of them. The most important, of course, are the Black Lives Matter movement, which got started in 2013, which this last summer, June, July, and August, was able to, after the death of George Floyd, killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, was able to pull as many as 15 million Americans out in demonstrations, probably the largest demonstration wave in American history. Also, proponents of a Green New Deal, like the Sunrise Movement. Also, we should include in the left unions, left-leaning unions with social democratic agendas, like the Service Employees Union, which is the major union behind the fight for a $15 an hour wage, which has been successful in many states, though it really hasn't helped build the union movement itself very much. And also explicitly socialist groups. Since the waning of the Socialist Party in the 1960s in the United States and the waning of the Communist Party in the 1950s, there has really been no prominent popular socialist group in America. But beginning in 2015, one of the long-lasting socialist groups, Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, which was founded by New York intellectuals like Michael Harrington and Irving Howe, and some younger people as well, way back in the early 80s, grew tremendously, mushroomed from 6,000 members in 2015 to now 85,000 members, which is certainly much more quickly than any socialist movement has ever grown in American history, even though it's still below the numbers proportionally of past movements like the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. But DSA has chapters in every metropolitan area in the United States, and its membership, of course, is predominantly young and predominantly people who have college educations or getting college education. One should also mention members of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives and one member in the Senate, that is Bernie Sanders, who here's some of the four most famous members of the Progressive Caucus, the so-called Squad. Representatives Tlaib from Detroit, Omar from Minneapolis, Ocasio-Cortez from New York City, and Presley from Massachusetts. There's about 100 members of the Progressive Caucus. Most of them supported Bernie Sanders' campaign for president this year. Some supported his campaign for president in 2016 as well. Many people who are part of the Progressive Caucus join it because they want to be able to brag in their districts that they're members of it, but they don't have the same more left-wing agenda that these four representatives have and that Bernie Sanders does. But it's a growing group. And also, one should also mention what you might call the professional progressives. People like me, academics, especially in humanities and social sciences, journalists, various entertainers, philanthropists, social media personalities. And this group of professional progressives is, I think, the most visible group on the left, which is not necessarily a good thing for the American left because it allows conservatives to claim that the left is basically a movement of elitist, well-educated people and nobody else. But at the same time, it increases the visibility of left-wing ideas. And of course, you have figures like Ocasio-Cortez, who is known around the country to most people who care about politics only by her initials, which is quite a feat for someone who's only been in Congress for less than 2 years and is still in her early 30s. Now, where does this left come from? Well, it has roots deep in American history in many ways. Certainly, there have been socialists in America since the days of the Communist Manifesto. But I think we should really date the emergence of this particular left from the beginnings of the new left of the 1960s, which is the left that I joined back when I was in college. Both in terms of its racial composition, in terms of its class composition, even in terms of its regional composition, being an overwhelmingly urban and to some degree suburban movement, the left really got to start in the 60s with the movement, of course, of the new left, which is predominantly a young movement, predominantly a movement of people either who were in college or had been in college. And here's one of the better known images of the new left, of course, the demonstrations against the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, where I was a participant and was arrested. And in many ways, also the profile of sort of cosmopolitan dissenters that I'm outlining here has been protesting what they see as the establishment of the Democratic Party ever since 1968, ever since the convention which tore the Democratic Party apart, which nominated Hubert Humphrey, but which alienated many young anti-war Democrats back then, and which helped to lead to the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. This was really the last time, 1968, when liberal Democrats sort of called the tune, set the agenda for American politics, with the possible exception of the first couple of years of Barack Obama's first administration. So, ever since then, the American left, like the Democratic Party, especially more recently, has been a sort of top-bottom coalition of well-educated, cosmopolitan professionals, those professional progressives I mentioned before, and activists from African-American community, from some portions of the Latino community. And this, as I'm sure you all know, is really the profile of social democratic and labor parties throughout Europe now, perhaps of the the Labor Party in Israel as well. That is the broad middle of native-born working class in the United States, European American working class people have, gradually but surely been leaving the Democratic Party. Not for every office, but certainly in presidential races. And of course, we saw that this year, as we did in 2016, as we have pretty much in every presidential race since 1996. So in this sense, the left to the left of the Democratic Party and the left within the Democratic Party is very similar to basically the base of the Democratic Party more generally. It's what some people call a dumbbell coalition, very strong on both ends, but very thin in the middle. Now to the election, which just ended. I think it's just ended. At least everyone outside Donald Trump and his family believes it has just ended. Well, as I'm sure you know, the left got a big boost of visibility and support in the Democratic Party, and outside it too, I think, from a simple decision made by an independent senator from Vermont in 2015. Bernie Sanders decided to run for president as a Democrat, and that really made all the difference. In the past, self-proclaimed socialists like Sanders had always run as socialists in one or another socialist party and were marginal to the electoral contest almost everywhere where they ran as a third party. I don't have to, I'm sure for those who know about American history, rehearse the woes of third parties in the American political system. The fact that Bernie Sanders, who was not actually a Democrat, he was and continues to call himself an independent, decided to run as a Democrat, enabled him to draw media attention, enabled him to recruit money and activists to support him in 2016, to run a pretty close race against Hillary Clinton that year, and then again to be the main competitor to Joe Biden in this year's campaign, this year's Democratic primary campaign. His surprisingly close, albeit losing races against both Clinton and Biden, brought a visibility to social democratic proposals and a legitimacy to the very term socialism that neither has really enjoyed since the 1960s, if one could argue not since the 1930s, actually, when there was a socialist left, which had a lot of support than any explicitly socialist left has had since that point over the last almost 90 years now. Hundreds of young leftists who worked for Sanders campaigns then went on to run for office themselves as Democrats. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was an organizer around the country for Bernie Sanders before she ran for Congress in 2018. And that's true of many, many people who have been running either as explicit socialists or as progressive Democrats. They were inspired by Sanders' campaign. Some of them, of course, had been involved in the left before Sanders' campaign, but they got the confidence to decide to run for office because Sanders did so well in his campaign. And quite a few, in the hundreds, have been elected as Democrats in solidly Democratic districts in towns and cities around the country. Also in 2020, the race, the base that Sanders built nudged Biden and other Democratic contenders to take stands that I think are pretty far to the left of where the center of the party was when Barack Obama moved out of the White House in 2017. In 2020, every Democratic candidate for president endorsed either Medicare for all or a robust public option, including giving Americans an option to be part of a government paid healthcare plan, or keeping their private insurance if they want to do that. Every really contending Democrat who ran for president, it was in favor of doubling the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is what a $50 an hour wage would mean, because right now, scandalously, the minimum wage in the US is only $7.25 an hour. It's been there for over a decade. Every Democratic candidate supported higher taxes on the rich, though the details of that, of course, provoke very furious disagreements between people like Biden and people like Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Every Democratic candidate supported legislation to facilitate union organizing. Union density, that is the percentage of Americans who are in unions, is about 10% now, and when it was over 20%, Democrats were the majority party in the country and won most presidential elections and controlled Congress. So expanding union density in America would be a huge aid to Democrats winning elections. And every Democratic contender this year also supported a transition to an economy based on sources of renewable energy. So Bernie Sanders, the socialist from Vermont, then who's pushing 80 years old, and if you will be 80 years old next year, will be remembered, I think, as a more transformative figure than many politicians who've actually won the nomination of their party, and even some politicians in America who've won the presidency, but who most Americans were quite glad to put behind them after they left office. That would include George W. Bush, for example. The progressive journalist Harold Meyerson, a friend of mine who writes for the American Prospect and also for Dissent, the magazine that I was co-editor of for 12 years. I just retired from it last month. Harold Meyerson wrote this, and I think it's a wise statement about Sanders' impact on the left and on the country as well. Meyerson wrote, more than anyone else, Bernie created the current American left, but just as much, by running for president, he revealed its existence, surprising the nation, surprising the left, surprising himself. As an historian, I always frown on the idea that one human being can make a huge amount of difference in history, though obviously some human beings can, but usually they have to be ones who lead major parties or lead their nations or dictators, in their countries. And of course, Sanders is none of those things. But I think he has had a tremendous impact on the Democratic Party and on enhancing and enlarging the visibility of the left. Now, inevitably, a revived left in the Democratic Party posed a dilemma this year for Democrats hoping to win a victory large enough to enable its office holders to enact the kind of progressive policies that the left wants. Left-wing movements that I mentioned before, Black Lives Matter, the environmental movement, others, both helped and hurt Democrats in the election this year. On the one hand, young voters turned out in larger numbers than ever before in American history, since polls have been tracking how different age cohorts vote. Voters 18 to 29 this year voted. Half of them who were eligible to vote actually voted, which is astonishing. Even in 2008, when Barack Obama was running, fewer than 40% of young voters voted. He was very popular, as you know, among young Americans of all races. This year, half of all eligible young voters voted. 67% or 68% of all eligible Americans voted this year, which is also higher than any time actually in 120 years since 1900, when William Jennings Bryan ran his second and losing campaign for president. So young voters, especially who turn out to vote, and many of them, of course, young voters, Black voters and Latino voters, probably helped win Georgia and Arizona for Democrats, which I'm sure if you follow the election returns, you know Democrats have not carried either state since Bill Clinton ran for president in the 1990s. And also there was what you might call a popular front that supported Joe Biden. You had far leftists, like radical leftists, like Angela Davis, former vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party, supporting Joe Biden. You had Noam Chomsky, who needs no introduction to this audience, I'm sure, supporting Joe Biden. You had confessed Maoists and Stalinists supporting Joe Biden, and you had neoconservatives like William Kristol supporting Joe Biden as well. This is a pretty broad coalition, as broad as any time in American history supporting a Democratic candidate, and several African-American leftists who elected to Congress from New York State, from Chicago, St. Louis, will broaden the progressive caucus in Congress. And here's some of the people who Bernie Sanders endorsed for Senate and House in this campaign. On the other hand, if you've been following election returns as obsessively as I have, and I certainly wouldn't expect you to, probably not a good thing to follow them as obsessively as I have, you will note that of these six figures, only 3 of them were successful in winning. Jamal Bowman from New York 16th District, Mondaire Jones from 17th District in New York, and Cori Bush from the 1st District in Missouri. All three of these figures are African-American. All three of them won in primaries against, were nominated in primaries against sitting Democratic members of the House of Representatives, and all of them won in districts where any Democrat could have won. In contrast, Charles Booker ran for the US Senate in a primary in Kentucky, where if he'd won the primary, he would have had to run against, of course, Mitch McConnell, who won easily in his race, and he didn't even get nominated as a progressive Democrat in Kentucky. Mike Siegel ran in a swing district in Texas, did get nominated, but lost, and Lopez ran in a swing district in New York as well, and lost in the primary. So clearly, endorsement from Bernie Sanders can help you win in a deep blue district in the United States, districts that any Democrat could win, where many older Democrats, more moderate Democrats, have not kept touch with their districts, which have moved to the left. These are districts, sort of top-bottom districts with a lot of college-educated people, professional progressives, as well as many working-class people, Black and Latino, and Asian American in some places. But elsewhere, the left program, even be called a Bernie supporter, it was not a positive thing for many candidates. Calls for the Black Lives Movement to defund the police, for example, the ability for Republican candidates in swing districts to brand the Democrats as being led by radical socialists, probably convinced enough voters in swing districts, congressional districts around the country, and maybe in some Senate races to support Republicans. And in most of those districts, it was moderate Democrats who did not support defunding the police, which meant for some people abolishing the police, but for most people actually meant just cutting back on their budgets. So we had this result, which I'm sure you've all heard of, that Joe Biden won a very convincing victory. He won the popular vote by almost the same percentage that Barack Obama won the popular vote against Mitt Romney in 2012, about 4 percentage points, won the Electoral College by the same exact total that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 4 years ago. But the Democrats gained just 1 seat in the Senate and lost 10 seats and maybe more in the House. And so they'll have one of the smallest majorities, just 4-seat majority of any congressional majority in many years. So the left giveth and taketh away, you might say. For all their zeal and all their increased influence, too many American leftists, I think, in and outside the Democratic Party, believe that the main obstacles to getting most ordinary white working class Americans on their side are not that they've failed to persuade those people to support their policies and their way of seeing the world, but that the main obstacles are within the Democratic Party itself, or within the liberal establishment itself. The main obstacle many leftists believe are establishment Democrats who criticize them, who tell lies about their programs, or the mainstream media that don't publicize left-wing positions enough or misrepresent those positions. There's a lot of sniping, snarling within the Democratic Party by many people who were fairly new to the Democratic Party, who came into the party along with Bernie Sanders' campaign, who sometimes believe that Bernie Sanders was cheated out of winning the nomination in 2016 and believe that most Democrats sort of ganged up to defeat him this year, which when of course, as you probably know, after the South Carolina primary, which Biden won, the first primary he won, most Democrats who were contending against him dropped out of the race, supported Biden because they wanted to make sure that he would win the nomination and Bernie Sanders would not. So there's a bit of truth to that charge, but at the same time, the problem with it for leftists is that, very simply, most people in America who vote Republican actually agree with Republican views, whether on economics or on affirmative action or on welfare programs or on abortion, most importantly. So as always, the task of the left is to change people's minds. And simply exposing more Americans to left-wing views will not itself be sufficient. They have to be persuaded. Now, organizing, the magic verb, has always been essential to the left building itself when it has built itself to a major force. This is something which, the left will not be able to get beyond its current confines in cosmopolitan circles for the most part, unless it figures out ways to organize white workers in Ohio who've lost their jobs, for example, or Mexican Americans in South Texas who voted in large numbers for Donald Trump this time, many of whom have jobs as policemen or border guards, or in the families of people who are police or border guards. Well, I want to leave time for questions and comments, but let me say a few things about the future. What should progressive Democrats and movements do now? Now, of course, I say this, you said, the host said this was academic talk. Yes, it's an academic talk, but I am also an activist and have been for many years, editing this publication, Dissent Magazine, which I urge you all to look at. This is the current issue. So I'd be dishonest, I think, if I didn't say something about how I think the left can move from protest to a serious share of power in the Democratic Party and therefore in the country. Now, I'm often asked by students and sometimes by journalists, to predict the future, and I like to say that historians are only useful at predicting the past. But let me say a little about the future, nevertheless. There's two things I think I can say with some confidence. First of all, the left has to find a way to compromise with Joe Biden and his administration, and with moderate Democrats in general. Left-wing posture demanding that Democrats, that the Biden administration accept left-wing proposals or risk a major conflict with the left if they don't, is a sure way of marginalizing the left, a sure way of the left getting blamed for the lack of progress in the next 2 years. And as I mentioned before, the fact that Democrats will probably not have a majority in the Senate if they don't win these two races in Georgia in January. They will have a very narrow majority in the House, means that unless something really radical changes, unless several Republicans retire and Democrats are elected to take their places, Biden will have to be probably happy enough, glad enough to put forth some proposals and try to sell them to Americans without actually getting most of them passed. So if the left divides the party, Democrats will almost surely lose the midterm elections in 2022 and quite likely the White House in 2024. And I say that not as someone who, of course, looks forward to that, but as a historian who knows that every time the Democratic Party has been badly divided, and this goes to the Republican Party too, Democrats have lost national power or failed to gain it. For those who know the history, those times happened in 1968, in 1972, in 1980, and in 2016. When the different factions in the party, a party that's always been a heterogeneous party, and especially since the 1960s, when Democrats gave up their terrible past as a racist party, they have been a very heterogeneous party. Democrats, when divided, always lose. And the left has a heavy responsibility, therefore, which many people on the left will not be happy with, to stomach some of the programs, some of the appointees, also some of the decisions that the Biden administration makes. Secondly, the most fruitful program for the left, I think, is a program that emphasizes universal programs. Help most Americans, especially most Americans who are not college graduates, which describes about 2/3 of all Americans. It's got to be a program that bridges the very sharp divisions in the country between people, different racial groups, between different regions, especially urban and rural, and of course, bridges of gaps of political ideology as well. Programs that did this in the past and helped Democrats win office include security, Medicare, a higher minimum wage, and Obamacare too, despite all the trouble that it caused Democrats when Obama himself was in power. Ever since Donald Trump and the Republican Congress tried to appeal it and failed, Obamacare steadily has become more and more popular because many of its elements are universal programs, like covering anybody under 26 on their parents' plan, like covering anybody with pre-existing conditions. Ideas people on the left espouse, like reparations for African Americans, like transgender rights, have a lot of moral cachet in the left, and they're ones that are, certainly one can argue morally important and necessary programs, but programs like reparations, like transgender rights, are not going to win over culturally conservative working class voters. And those are the voters Democrats are going to need to win over. So I say that to acknowledge that the Democratic Party and the left generally are made up of people with proud identities that are vital to their politics, religious identities, racial identities, gender identities. But both the left and the party have to find ways to respect those identities without basing their political appeal on them. Because if the left bases political appeal on those and the Democratic Party does, then the Democratic Party and the left will lose together. And one of the positive things I think about Bernie Sanders' campaign is he focused on economic populist programs in a way even Democrats to the right of him, like Barack Obama many times did not do. So in conclusion, the US is in crisis. We know the crisis of the pandemic, which has killed 260,000 people already, will surely kill many thousands more between a vaccine is available to most people. An economic crisis, which is caused partly by the crisis of the pandemic, a climate crisis, and a left that's strategically intelligent can play an important part in solving those crises and moving the US toward becoming a more decent society. We'll see in the next few years if the left is up to that task. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Right, the question is the left strategically thinking, right?
By the way, just one quick thing. I forgot to show this slide. This was the last time a liberal Democrat proposed a far-reaching program of universal programs, Franklin Roosevelt. But of course, we have none of them as part of American politics today, unfortunately. So,
okay, thank you very much, Michael. And there's obviously so much to talk about, and I think I wrote down like 10 questions. So now I want to invite Dr. Ronny Regev to respond. Dr. Regev teaches modern US history at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She's particularly interested in how the political economy and everyday life shape one another. Her first book from 2018 was Working in Hollywood, How the Studio System Turned Creativity into Modern Labor. And it's a terrific book. And I want to invite her now to respond. Ronny, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yoav, for inviting me, and especially to comment on the work of a historian that my own education keeps bringing me back to his books. So Michael, that's obviously you. I don't know how many times at this point I've read The Populist Persuasion, but others as well. And when I thought about the comment I give today, I decided to do the one thing I know how to do as a historian, is really draw on the historical lessons I've learned, many of them from your books, and just add, I suppose, a few things, because I didn't know what you were going to say. And I guess the way this would link is really to add, I agree with you about the crisis. And I also, obviously agree with everything you said. And I also learned a few things that I didn't think about before. But I guess for me, I feel a concern in the last couple of years. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And I guess what I will add are the few obstacles from without that I see as the left facing. The left in the United States, probably not just. The first of which has to do with populism. And if I go back to your book, Michael's book, The Populist Persuasion, and the way you define populism, right, as a mode of persuasion, where politicians, or sometimes not politicians, describe some group, some other group, right, as transgressing on the nation's creed. These are the words, and using, some form of rhetorical optimism in order to to suggest bringing back the power to the people. And I think, I looked over the recent edition of this book, and where you actually mentioned Trump, and you point out that there are two kinds of populism, and they differ in the way they define the people. One of them defines it a bit more narrowly, and I think the Trump populist movement would be that brand, where the people are, well, those above making the decisions, the deep state, or clerks and politicians, but also implicitly, and sometimes not so implicitly, immigrants, people of a darker shade of skin. And so I think that one of the challenges for populists, for example, like Bernie Sanders, is that there is this competing form of populism in the political arena today, and the public arena, that offers very palatable ideas to a lot of people because of this rhetorical mode. So this is the one concern that I have, because it seems like definitely in the last 4 years, but I think we can still see the power of Trump and his mode of persuasion is very powerful. I mean, a lot of people voted for him this election too. As kind of this competition, or this competing form of populism, is another, I don't know, constraint or something to overcome. And this links to the second concern I often feel, and it's related, and that has to do with the media landscape, or the way people acquire knowledge these days. And I feel that it's both wider and narrower at the same time. There are more places for us to get information from. There's multiple websites and news channels, and we have access to all of them. I guess even Zoom is another example. But at the same time, it seems people are taking or getting their information from narrow sources, and they're narrowing still. And there are bubbles of, we call them echo chambers today. But I think these bubbles are sometimes wide open, right? And I feel today we're not just arguing about different sets of values, but we're sometimes even arguing about basic facts, and we don't have some sort of agreement about them. And I think that's, again, another challenge that any leftist movement needs to overcome, when you don't even have some sort of basic agreement on really very basic facts. For example, who won the election? Used to be clear. It is pretty clear, but still not so this time. And that leads me to the last thing, just a third point, and that has to do with really, I certainly agree with you about the compromises. I certainly agree that a left needs to.
Oh, Ronny, if you could just stop just for a second. I just have to, someone's knocking at my door. Be right there.
I'm stopping.
I'll be right there. Hold on.
The miracles of Zoom, right? This is, see, you wouldn't have had that if we were meeting in a Bar Shira or something. So this is a treat. Right, we have a treat. Here it is.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah, no, Zoom, that's how it happens. Right, just the last thing is just part of what comes with compromising and creating one big front and working with Biden, which again, I really have no qualms with that. I just, the calls that have been coming out from Biden and his camp, and not just that camp, since the elections, are these calls for unity that are the way to kind of, it's a discourse thing, right? But at the same time, I think that another concern for the left is, yes, unity, but at what price? Because I think that whenever in American politics, the emphasis was on unity, the people who paid the price are usually African Americans. And I'm thinking about the end of the Civil War, where, as David Blight showed us, unity kind of neglected any gains of the Reconstruction era, or some of them. And actually, I'm thinking even about your book with Morris Isserman, right, about the Second Civil War of the 1960s, where while there aren't any clear winners or losers from that one, you also mentioned there that it is African Americans and a lot of the policies that went to help them, like affirmative action, that were gutted in the backlash, the political backlash that came after that. So it's not, again, this is not to say that making compromises and creating one united front is not important. It is, I certainly agree, but I think that a concern that has to come with it is really, I agree with you, not to define the movement by identity politics, but to be very wary that the people carrying those identities don't pay the price. Yeah, I mean, these are just the only things I'll add. Of course, again, I don't think they. I'll just end by the fact that with all my concerns, I feel like at the end of the day, I always quote Baldwin on this, James Baldwin, that you have to be an optimist because we're alive, and being a pessimist is an academic matter. So I am an optimist, and I believe that the left can survive whatever it is. It must survive. So, and thank you again so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much. Should I comment or should I just go to questions?
Maybe, yeah, if you want to respond directly to some of what Ronny said, that'd be a great.
Maybe just sure. I really want to hear, and thanks a lot for your comment, and thanks for the kind words about the populism book. If anybody wants to translate it to Hebrew, feel free. But I know most, every Israeli academic can read English. But anyway, well, maybe I'll just comment on the last thing about the left, identity politics, and compromise. I certainly wouldn't talk about unity. I talk about compromise. I think there's a difference, and it's a real dilemma. On the one hand, yes, the left grows by, and this is true throughout history, by having clear objectives, articulating them in inspiring ways, building its own constituency, and then constituency large enough to be able to bargain with those in power. That's sort of social movement. Sociology 101, social movements have to affect the polity has to be compelled to work with the social movements. But, of course, when you go into politics, you got to win a majority. And of course, the American political system, as you all know, we have this ridiculous system going back to the 18th century, where winning enough popular votes doesn't elect you president, and where a citizen of Wyoming has 50 times more power in the U.S. Senate than a citizen of California. And every senator is equal, even though every senator represents, completely different numbers of people. So that's a dilemma for the left, because on the one hand, the left has to push left-wing programs and enlarge, what the meaning of the left is, the numbers the left has, and its strategic intelligence, and working on that. On the other hand, has to avoid dividing the Democratic Party. Now, this part of the Democratic Party has to avoid dividing the Democratic Party so that, there's, as I said, there's a very real possibility Democrats lose Congress in 2022 and then lose the presidency in 2024. Biden is, let us say, not the most inspiring figure one can imagine. He is, most Americans voted for him because he was not Trump. In fact, if it had said on the ballot, not Trump or Trump, I would want a larger victory. Because some Republicans, I don't like Biden very much, but I really don't like Trump. They might have voted for him. So that's the problem. And it's a dilemma, as you know. Dilemma means two equally unpalatable alternatives. You have to choose one, and you have to work with that. That's all I have to say. If I'm not a political activist, luckily. My son is Democratic Party operative. I depend on him for strategic advice. I just get to write about it. So.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Ronny. I have a question of my own, and then I'll open it up to maybe a few emails that I got with some questions. I have a question about, we keep talking about the left, right? Even when we think about the left as in terms of terminology, is it still relevant? Is it still useful to, right? Because in a way, we are reproducing some of these ideological debates that maybe are anachronistic. They go back to a political economy of Marx's time, right? And the question is, there's almost as if it's something self-defeating when we still use that, because that, as we saw, it's, you know, it's grist for the mill of conservatives and Republicans who can say socialism, communism, right? And then they bring back those haunting relics, right, of the Cold War, which seem never to leave us, even though the generation passes. You know, especially I'm looking at polling from Florida now. You know, and especially among Cuban Americans, obviously for them this is so powerful. So my question is I guess, just in terms of thinking about the left, can we continue to talk about the left in that way, or should we think about maybe adapting it, you know, rethinking it to a more relevant definition, even that relates to today's political economy, but also to identity politics, please?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, it's very difficult to tell people what to call themselves. So it doesn't usually work. But, you know, most people who are on the left call themselves progressives now. Now, of course, that's a spongy term. If you know American political history, you know, it covered, you know, Henry Wallace, 1948, his party, which was basically run by communists, the Communist Party, Teddy Roosevelt's party in 1912. I mean, it covers lots of things. But, you know, that's most people on the left would say, okay, progressive is a fine term. But of course, most people who are liberals who don't necessarily agree with, certainly with the Bernie Sanders kind of politics, also call themselves progressive. So, and the Progressive Caucus in Congress, you know, as I mentioned before, is made up of the most left-wing people in the House of Representatives. So, I mean, that's a term that, you know, most people use. But then again, you know, people on the left, like, especially intellectuals, like people who work in dissent, many others, it's very important for them to differentiate themselves from liberals. You know, I think this is the problem. You know, liberals are not the enemy so much, but they're certainly in the way. And therefore, if liberals call themselves progressives, and many liberals do, then people on the left want to say, oh, no, we're not that. You know, we want to go beyond what Obama managed to accomplish. And we don't want, for instance, right now, you know, Biden, as you know, is appointing his cabinet, which he helps people get through the confirmation process in the Senate. And some of these people are described by, you know, the New York Times, Washington Post as progressives. But most people on the left would say, no, they're liberals, and we want to go beyond that. But so I think you're right, but progressive is probably the best umbrella term we have, but there's problems with that as well. Whereas conservatives have no problem calling themselves conservative, whether they're, you know, people there who are neo-fascists or libertarians. You know, they all say we're conservatives, and they're able to fight within that label. I'm not sure that works. You can't fight within a label, but you know what I mean. So,
right.
But terminology matters a lot. I mean, as Ronny said, you know, I wrote a lot about populism as a language and as a discourse, and I think. You know, it'd be good if everyone, you know, on the left could agree on what to call themselves. But as long as there's a division between left and liberals, they probably won't.
So a couple of questions. One I see here in the chat. One was emailed to me by some of our graduate students. So the first question is there a threat, especially we're talking about the Biden cabinet, which right now is being appointed. Do you see a possible threat that the Democratic Party, in a very strange inversion of reality, is becoming the party of neoliberalism, right? Kind of the party which has gotten most of the support of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, right? And just, you know, look at that during the elections, right? Where California, right, it votes for Biden so overwhelmingly, and it is so progressive on many things, and yet they had that that ballot initiative about giving workers' rights to Uber drivers, right? And again, it's that how you would think, wait, how could California do that, right? But here is that threat maybe that some leftists within the Democratic Party, I think, rightly raise. And do you share that concern?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've certainly, you know, since the 1960s, of course, the Democratic Party certainly moved to, you know, to accept, at least at the national level, to accept, you know, ideas and more programs and ideas that we identify with neoliberalism, balancing the budget, weakening unions, and so forth, even cutting back on government programs, welfare programs. But I think that's less true now. I mean, again, one of the impact that Bernie Sanders and those who supported him and Elizabeth Warren had in the Democratic Party is to move the center of the Democratic Party left. I mean, Joe Biden has committed himself, at least rhetorically, we'll have to see what happens, to strengthening unions. And as I mentioned during my talk, you know, the union movement was so essential to making the Democrats the majority party in the 1930s and 40s and into the 1960s. And this is something, I mean, any definition of neoliberalism, it doesn't include a much stronger union movement, I don't think. Also, it doesn't include higher taxes on the rich, which also Biden has talked about. Now, we'll see what happens. And of course, Republicans who are very much wedded to a neoliberal program will try to defeat these ideas. But I think important for people to realize how the Democratic Party has actually changed. No, it's not become Bernie Sanders' party, but then he lost the primary. So if you lose the primary, it doesn't become your party. But he and other people on the left have had a lot of influence on it. And the base has moved to the left as well. I mean, think about California. Obviously, Joe Biden won California popular vote by 5 million. That I think it was Proposition 22 in California, lost by a smaller amount. And remember, even though Biden won California by a 2-to-1 margin, you know, that still meant millions of votes by Republicans who probably almost all of them, not all of them, probably most of them voted against that proposition. So, you know, you do a Venn diagram and you find that, yes, certainly some people voted for Biden, voted against that, but most people voted against it, probably actually voted against Biden. The Democratic Party did not oppose that proposition. In fact, the proposition was one that was overturned, unfortunately, from my point of view, a law that was passed by the California legislature, dominated by Democrats and signed by Democratic governor. So Democrats in California, on record, and in California where I used to live, has this system, as people might know, started 100 years ago during the progressive era. If you don't like a law that the legislature passes, you can put it up for a vote by, it's called the referendum process. And those referendums are usually supported by a lot of money. And when something which will help business, like Proposition 22, which of course is going to help Uber and Lyft and other ride-sharing companies, they put huge amount of money into it. They're outspent. Those who oppose them are outspent 10 to 1. 10 to 1. That rarely happens in American politics. Anyone is outspent by 1,000%. So anyway, so I think Democrats have moved beyond neoliberalism to an extent. We'll have to see what happens.
I have another question here. I'll read out from Or, one of our graduate students in the history department. And it's about the role of Jews in the left, which of course is so central to the history of the left in the United States. And he writes that 2 of the congressional districts that you mentioned, the New York 16th and 17th, are 2 of the most Jewish congressional districts in the country. Historically, Jews were an important part of the 1960s left, of course. Do you still see that the case? So do you still see Jews as an active part of the contemporary American left?
Well, obviously, coming from a Jewish family and a family of Jewish liberals / leftists, my father cast his first vote for Earl Browder in 1936. When even the Democrats, when even the communists didn't want you to vote for Earl Browder, they wanted you to vote for FDR, as people know about the Popular Front. Anyway, and my uncle Daniel Bell was a socialist, throughout his life, though a conservative in some ways as well. Anyway. Well, the Jewish vote, first of all, as people probably know, went as heavily for Joe Biden as they went for Barack Obama, and of course the only group among Jewish population that votes Republican or Orthodox Jews, and some of them in those districts, of course. But I think, I mean, the groups I mentioned who are strong in the left, college-educated people from cosmopolitan areas, cities and suburbs. I mean, this is where Jews live in America. You know that, right? And so many activists in these movements that I mentioned, even Black Lives Matter, the white activists in it are Jewish. I don't know the numbers. So, I would say, I mean, partly my understanding of this is skewed. I haven't done the research, but skewed by, being Code of Dissent, of course, a magazine which was founded by people on the Jewish left. And we still talk about people who write for dissent as dissentniks. So, so colored by that, but also I just know that so many arguments that people have on the left take place, whether it's about Israel or about race, take place between Jews as well. So now again, I haven't done the research. I'm not a sociologist, and it'd be interesting to see actually whether young Jews in college are as left as Jews from my baby boom generation or from the millennial generation, other generations in between. But I tend to think they are, and it's hard to believe that I haven't seen the polls that if 18 to 29-year-olds were the cohort that voted most strongly for Biden and for most Democrats generally, whether Jews in that generation didn't vote even more for them, except of course from those from already backgrounds and so forth. So I don't know, but I haven't seen any any evidence of a growth of Jewish conservatism, except again among the Orthodox population. But again, all of you might do research on this. I don't. I just going on my perceptions as a leftist.
Very good, thank you. Rana, do you have a concluding question that you would like to raise?
Well, I'm not sure as to a concluding question, but I was intrigued by the vote of Latinos in the US. And although you mentioned in your talk a couple of times how people in Florida or Texas voted, I'm still curious to know as to what influenced most this Republican vote on the part of Latinos. What was it mostly an economic vote? Did it have any relation to immigration policies promoted by Donald Trump, etc.?
Well, first of all, note something which a lot of people have written about recently since the election. I should have written about earlier. Latino or Hispanic was always a self-conscious construction by Hispanic and Latino activists and politicians beginning in the 1960s, actually, to put together these very dissimilar groups: Puerto Ricans, Cubans, more recently Central Americans, some people from South America. I mean, to share nothing but a language or a background of a language. I often say that what unites a Jewish psychiatrist from Argentina with a Central American worker from El Salvador who cleans houses, not much. Be able to understand, the same language. So that's the first thing to say. So it was always a myth that Black and brown people are going to vote the same, that they both see the world the same way. Of course, African Americans do share a history, even if Black African Americans come from the Caribbean or some more recently from Africa. Still, there's the history of slavery. There's this history of a common movement going back to slavery days and to the imprint on American culture, which is not something which Latinos can equal. And also, I mean, again, the U.S. is a big country, obviously, and all Latinos geographically not the same. I mean, in Los Angeles and Southern California, Latinos vote heavily Democratic. Why? First of all, because more educated in general, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is that so many of them are in unions, and unions run by Latinos in these areas have organized successfully. The union density in Los Angeles area is much higher than it is in places like South Texas, certainly, or South Florida. So that has an important meaning too. There are not time to talk about this, but parties in America are made up of so many sub-party organizations, which are identified with the party, part of movements in various ways, part of organizations which are not officially part of a party, but without which that party could not win national elections, or really most state or local elections either. And unions are very, very much a part of that. So those unions don't exist in South Texas. Also, South Texas, you have people, as I mentioned very quickly in my talk, who are first of all, they're from rural areas, so they're more affected by questions that rural people think about too. They tend to be more religious. They are often members of evangelical Protestant churches, which of course on the right politically for the most part. And also many of them in South Texas actually are part of families that are part of the Border Patrol. Even if they're part of families who are undocumented immigrants, they're also part of families that are part of the Border Patrol. It's not unusual, actually, for families, Mexican-American families in South Texas to have members of the family who are both guarding the border and often have gotten across the border illegally. I have colleagues at Georgetown who study this phenomenon, actually. And South Florida, as I'm sure you know, unusually demographically, because there it's mostly those who voted more Republican this year were from Cuban-American backgrounds and Venezuelan-American backgrounds, for whom the charge of socialism was very powerful. And also, finally, you know, I mean, Donald Trump was and is, you know, a very charismatic figure. You know, he's a figure who he was in power. He was and he did get a surprising number of Latinos to campaign for him. And so, you know, Seymour Martin Lipset, who I used to be friends with, the sociologist who passed away several years ago, people know his work. He used to say, you know, we don't know yet. This is back in the 1980s. We don't know yet whether Hispanics will be voting more like blacks or more like Italians. And I think national vote, we don't know because exit polls are really not very reliable this year because of all the people who voted by mail. But the exit polls we have show that nationally, Latinos voted about the same percentage in 2020 as they did in 2016, about 2/3, more or less, 65% voted for Democrats, voted for Biden. But locally, of course, it could be very different, you know. So, you know, I think that's the best answer I have to give about that. And unfortunately, I've got to leave.
All right, so on that note,
I want to thank all of you for coming at your dinner hour and my lunch hour now. And you know, I hope to maybe zoom into one of the future talks in this series. So thanks very much.
You're always invited, and I want to really convey my gratitude to you, Michael, to Ronny, to Ranan, to Mayan and Or, who helped organize this. And I want to just take a chance to mention our coming attractions, right? The Center for the Study of the United States in partnership with the Fulbright program. We have 3 additional events about the US election planned for the next month. So please tune in our website, our Facebook page, YouTube, and also the Danny Abraham Center has an event in 1 week exactly at this time. Opportunities and Challenges as Chile adopts the new constitution. It's going to be next Tuesday at 6 as well. So check that out and follow us on social media. And that's it, I think. I want to thank everyone here really for taking the time and participating. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.